Welcome! In this series of videos we will look at software add-ons for both the PowerBasic console and Windows compilers. Today we will look at dynamic form creation and layout using the Layout32 add-on from Prometheus Software. Today we're going to take a second look at the Layout32 library as an add-on to PowerBasic Windows compiler. If we have a look at this small executable we have here, it displays the trial version because that's what we're demonstrating at the moment. The commercial version of course doesn't show this pop-up. And there is our dialog. We have two label controls on the form, two text boxes on the form, and a button. Now this form is resizable. If we stretch the form to the right, the second text box gets bigger. If we bring it down to the bottom, it stretches towards the bottom, and the exit button is always centered at the bottom of the form. And the form itself has a minimum size, below which we cannot go. Well, that all seems quite straightforward. Let's have a look at the code. Now, this is our application code here. I've done something a wee bit different with this application. This is actually making use of a library. So if we look at the code, there's an include for the Windows API, which you would normally expect in your Windows application programs. There's an include for the Layout32, and the static linked library for Layout32 is also underneath that. Now I'm including one new library you haven't seen before, the Dynamic Form Runner library, which is recently created, and underneath that, this is the rest of the application. Now you may ask, where's the definition of the dialog? Where is the text boxes, labels and button coming from? Well, what we're doing in this application is we have removed the logic which defines what appears on the form and the form itself from the application. It's held externally. So we have two functions in here, a load dynamic form file and a display dynamic form. Both of these functions are enough to supply the application, which we're currently looking at, with all the information it needs to display a form on the screen. And after exiting from these functions, it will display a message box to say done. So when we execute our application, we get the splash screen up, we get the form, and when we hit the exit button, we get the message box to say done, and the application ends. So where is the information for those two labels, those two text boxes and the button coming from? Well, we have an external file, which is a basic text file, which is dynamic form runner def.txt. Now if we open that up, we will see that there are a number of lines of information held within that file. We have the name of the form, the object type on the form, the width and height of the object, its location on the screen, the title that is to go on the object if it has a title, an action for the object, a colour, a focus, multi-line, and a series of other properties. We're going to cover these one at a time. So, if we have a look at the code itself, if we look inside our library, the first thing it does is it loads the dynamic form file. Basically loads that text file we've just been looking at. So if we have a look at the include file, and there is our function to load the dynamic form file. All this does, it looks for the def.txt file based on the path of our executable and the name of the executable. It then checks to see if the file exists. If the file does exist, it calls the read the file into array. Now this is a function we prepared in a previous video called the PB file handling routines. It's held in that library. And if we actually manage to load it into the array, we're prepping another array with dynamic handles. And having loaded the dynamic form, the next thing to do is to display the dynamic form. And there is a function that performs that. And this goes through a number of subroutines to pull back the information from the text file we looked at earlier. For example, we're driving it by the form name. Now you'll see that one of the parameters it's passed is actually the form name. This means our text file could contain multiple forms. We could add an additional form onto this. We can add additional objects. And we're pulling back the properties of that particular object. For example, the title, the size, as in the width and the height of the object, the location on screen, and this is where the dialog is actually created. This is where the dialog new command comes in. Now this is a beginning to dynamic forms. There's probably a great deal more we can actually do on them, but this displays the basics. Having created the dialog, we then display the dynamic controls. And in this function, as you will see, we are pulling back all the properties of the object. So it's running round the array of all the objects that were defined in that text file. It's pulling the information from the text file to get the information of where to place it on the screen. And this is where the Layout32 comes in. If we have a look at our file again, we'll find that for each object we wish to control the resizing, there are two sets of properties, resize 1 and resize 2. These are the rules that you're going to apply to the object. In this case, this object is going to move when the form gets resized. The bottom of the object is going to be moved, and it's going to be moved relative to the bottom of the form. And in this object at the bottom here, the object is going to be stretched. It's the right hand side of the object that's going to be stretched, and it's going to be stretched as the right hand side of the form is stretched. And this one here has two rules, so it's also going to be stretched at the bottom of the object to the bottom of the form. So as the bottom of the form moves down, the bottom of the object will follow it. And this one here, which is a button, not only is it moved to the bottom of the screen as the bottom of the screen gets bigger, it's horizontally centered in the middle of the form. So having set all these objects, it'll be fairly obvious to you that although at the moment they're held within a flat text file, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever that this information couldn't be got from a database or some other external source. So that all the logic to define your form comes from outside your application. So you would end up with a generic application onto which other things could be added. So what could we add to this application without having to change the code and recompile? Well, if we add a new line in here, and we're going to add a new label, and we'll say this label is going to be around 130 by, say, 12. And we want to position that on screen somewhere further over, say to the right of the first one. So we'll say 250, and we'll say it's going to be 60 down, and we will put a title on that one for a label. And we have no action on that one, but like all the other ones, we'll make the label blue, let's just move over a little bit. Now this one's not multi-line, but we want to put some resize rules on it. So let's just put it in as it stands at the moment, and we'll see what it does. So let's just save that and go back to our code again. Now we won't recompile the program, we'll just rerun the program, and we'll see that we now have a new label. Now we haven't put any rules in for resizing, so the label is fixed on the screen, but the label has quite happily appeared on the screen in the colour we specified. So let's put some rules in. So we want it to move. So we'll put a move command in. Now we want the left hand side of the object to move, and it will be tied to the right hand side of the form. So if we save that and we run our application again and we move the right hand side of the form, then the object will happily move on screen. Now that's all we have to do for that particular object, because like the other label it doesn't need to move down as the form moves down. But let's put a text control underneath this to mirror this one here. So let's add an additional line. And we'll make this one a text control, and we'll say it's again 130 along, and we'll make this one 80 down so it ties up with this other text one. And we'll make this one, say for example, 250 wide, and so this is the location 250 to the right, so it lines up with underneath the more info label, and we'll say it's 74 down so it's below the label. And we'll put some text into the text box. And this one's not going to have a colour. And we won't put the other details in yet, we'll just let it display this on the screen. So we'll say this is going to be multi-line, so you can actually put some text into it. So if we save that and run our application now, which again has not been recompiled, it's the same application all the time, and there's our text box with the word test in it. And it supports multi-line quite happily. And if we try and stretch it, we'll see that it is not moving because we haven't given it any rules yet. So let's give it some rules for stretching. So we know we want to do more or less what we did with the other one. So we want to move it. And in this case, we want to move the left of the object, because as the right hand side of the form moves, we don't want to be overwritten by the text box to our left, so we want to move our new text box as the right hand side actually of the form moves. So if we try that, run our program again, we'll see that as the form expands to the right, our text box moves to the right and keeps the same distance from the other text box. The other text box is not overwriting it now. And if we stretch down, it stays where it is because we haven't given it a rule for that yet. So let's add in that additional rule. Now we want to do a stretch in this case. And we want to stretch the bottom of our object to the bottom of the form, just like we did with the other one. And if we save that and run our program again, which again has not changed, and we stretch to the right, it continues to move, we pull it down and the box gets stretched with it. And if we do both at the same time, it will quite happily support that nicely. And we can tab between the controls. And additionally, there is logic underneath the exit button to close the form. And it's all been controlled from this one text file. And again, as I said, it doesn't have to be a text file, it could be coming from a database. And in here, this is the logic that actually performs the calls to the Layout32 library. So we're picking up the information from our columns within that text file, and we're setting these variables to be left, top, right, bottom. And once we have all the information we need for the object, we're adding buttons, adding labels, setting the colour of the labels, setting the properties of the text box. Is it multi-line? Is it not multi-line? Adding the text box itself, checking to see if we wish the text box to have focus, and these are where we add the resize rules. These are the calls to the Layout32 library, which tells it, in this case, we want to horizontally centre, or we want to move, or we want to stretch. And the same for the second set of rules. I've set the system up so it supports two quite separate rules that can be applied to each object on the screen. Now there may be a need in future to add more rules per object. This is a nice start to a dynamic form. Now the other thing that's worth looking at is the callback function, our event handler. Now since it's also a dynamic callback function, there's nothing specific to the objects actually have in it. There is an initialization handler which sets the focus to the object which we've set up to have focus, and then there is a very generic command routine which basically picks up the object, and then at the moment all I've got in here is a check to see if the object happens to be a button. If it's a button, then we pick up the action we're going to do from the value inside the action column, and if that happens to say close dialog, then it closes the dialog. Now obviously, as you'll realise, if we want to do something more complex than just close the dialog, something for example to gather the information that's on all the objects on the screen, for example pick up the data that's put into the text boxes and do something with it, this will involve writing additional code. But for the moment, this is a nice demonstration of what you can do with the Layout32 library to dynamically create a dialog. There's much more we can do with the Layout32 libraries, and there's a great deal more we can do with dynamic forms. But that's it today. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.